So today we're going to go through touch and interoception. Touch being the last sense that we're going to touch on in the class. And then we're going to do some review. We'll have some review time at the end. So, because we've had some breaks, I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to ask questions. The exam's next week on Monday. So there will be one more office hour on Monday morning. But if anybody wants to meet or something before that, just send me a note. Or as usual, just ask questions on the outset. So the quote here is from Christopher Reeve, who some of you may not know who he is. Who's Christopher Reeve? The guy who played Superman. It's one of the guys that used to play Superman. And he fell off a horse, basically, and became paralyzed and eventually died. But he lived for many years after he was paralyzed. And through that rehabilitation process, he said this: to feel touch after years of going without it is very meaningful. It makes a huge difference. It means I can feel my kids' touch. It makes all the difference in the world. So I'm not sure if you've had this discussion. I think we did earlier in the course about, if you could only have one sense or two senses, which would they be? I think for all of us, if we lost any of our senses, we'd probably miss that sense for a while. But the sense of touch is a sense that is interesting in that it's not as precise as sight and sound, but it's something that we feel both the outsides and our insides through touch. We literally, inside of our bodies, things are touching each other all the time. Sometimes you'll feel it if you swell up or something like that. You'll feel things stretching or contracting inside your body. If you didn't feel that, things would be very different. So for the exam, you don't bring pencils, basically. There'll be, you're welcome to bring paper, but there'll be paper for you to write on. There will very likely be an online portion of the exam. But my rule is if I don't get it up there before midnight tomorrow, then there isn't going to be. But since I was working on it today, I feel pretty good it's going to be up there before midnight tomorrow. When it is up, I'll let you know it's up. So if I get it up today, I'll let you know it's up, so you can start working on it whenever you want to. Basically, my approach is to make the online portion kind of more similar to the homeworks, where you have to think and write or draw things. Because my objective is not to give you time to see what you can do in a short amount of time. I want to make sure you have enough time to think about it. And generally, those types of questions, you can use whatever resource you want, because they're not likely to find the answer. But if you do, then that's fine. The in-class is intended to be more straightforward, so that you have plenty of time in class to do it. So it's not more of an exam. I could give you all of it in class, but for some of you, you might feel time pressure in the class. I don't want you to have to go through that. The material is going to cover everything, or anything that we've covered in class, in the homeworks, or that's on the Moodle course page, or that's required reading, including the little videos, can be covered on the exam. My objective is not to surprise you. Basically, if you've pretty much understood what we've covered in class and the homeworks, you should do just fine on the exams. I do suggest you review the slides, though, and if there are areas you didn't quite get, or if on the homework you didn't quite get it, you might go through the class on Moodle or just put something up the outside. With that said, you should not be discussing the answers to the take-home part of the exam on Piazza. If you're confused about something, that's fine to ask that kind of question. Your work on the take-home part of the exam should be your own work. Which goes without saying. When we're done going through the rest of the actual content today, we'll go back to the exam and I'll review some of the things that we talked about in class and give you an opportunity to ask questions then. I added these to the Moodle page. One's a short video. Normally I would show it in class, but since we've been kind of cut short in classes this semester, I'm not going to show it in class, but it's a really good video. It's very short. On Moodle, it tells you where to start. You don't have to watch the whole thing. If you limit on time, you can just start wherever it says to start on Moodle. And then the Colab, we're not going to do coding, but you should be familiar with Colab. And at least what the libraries are that you use to do your homework. So we're not going to do actual software, but I do expect you to know what Colab is and what the libraries were that you used in your homework. Okay. So we're going to review here, and when I say we, I mean you. So this is basically what I want to do here is do what's called a compare and contrast. And what we're going to do is at the top, we're going to fill in what eyes, ears, tongues, and noses, whatever the plural of tongues, maybe it's just tongue, how they're like. And I've kind of grouped things, eyes and ears on the left and nose and tongue on the right, so that we can, oops, sorry. They receive input. Very good. What kind of input? What else? Let's pretend it's an exam. Huh?
They contribute to our senses.
Contributes to our senses. Yeah, one of the things that we've recognized is the word sense is kind of used, and it can mean different things. In the homework, you had the eyes and the brain example, and it was like, well, what sees? And the responses I got there actually were really good. So, you know, basically recognizing that the eyes are a really important part of seeing, but so is the brain's a very important part of seeing, and kind of depends on what you define as seeing. So for sure, the eyes and ears are just part of what it takes to sense something. Right? If you had the collection part of it, like the lens, like the eye, but you didn't have the cones and the rods, then you wouldn't be able to convert the electromagnetic energy into something else. And if you didn't have the bioelectric signaling, you wouldn't be able to convert the response of the rods or the cones into something that could get to your brain. So all that's part of sensing.
They are all in the head.
They're all in the head. All in our head.
Both all are part of the layer 2 of the HPAI.
Yeah. So here actually it's little bit strange how this is worded, because the eyes, where does the eyes sort of start and where the eyes sort of end? In some respects, part of the eyes is layer one because it's collecting. It's not really responding, it's collecting. Just like part of the ear is allowing the vibrations to make their way into the ear. And so that's still part of layer one. So there's sort of the interface there. So layers 1 and 2, layer 1, think about where the physical sort of interface is, where the collection's happening. And layer 2, with reception, think of it where there's that first sort of tangible conversion of whatever that physical energy is into something else. So like the lens allows the light to get to where the cones and the rods are, which is in layer 2. Okay. How are they different? And so the reason there's 2 of these, if you didn't figure it out, is you want to say what's common about the eyes and ears that's not true about the tongue and the nose, and then what's common about the tongue and the nose that's different from the eyes and the ears. I'm going to try to type it. Oh.
Eyes and ears, they waves.
Those were electromagnetic in different ways, but they're both waves. What else?
I actually remember some similarities.
Okay.
That is the McGurk effect. Eyes and ears. Yeah, the McGurk effect happens in the eyes and ears, but in tongue and nose happens something similar, but I don't remember the name. That when you taste something or you're smelling other thing, you yeah. I don't know the name, the equivalent. Tongue and nose, but there's similar effect.
Well, I'll at least put an example here that they collaborate in taste. And then we saw one example where in her book, in Lisa Feldman's book, where she seeing the diaper, so the visual, and combined actually with the nose to.
But ears and eyes help you with simulation of your surroundings.
Say again?
Eyes and ears help you with creating the virtual world.
So sort of like a spatial world, I think was what you. I'll put remote there because you're touching the sound waves and you're touching the electromagnetic waves, but they allow you to communicate with something that's at a distance. And then you might think that that you can smell something that's at a distance, but you're really smelling something that's biochemically interacting with something that's touching. So there's that transport. What about here on the tongue and the nose? These are different than over here. So it's similar, biochemical is similar between tongue and nose, but different than eyes and ears.
That's right. Question about tongues and nose. They have like it's It's something funny that, for example, that when you're laughing, that your drink might go through your nose. I remember that.
Just say they're interconnected. Okay. Now I'll just add one here to distinguish it. We kind of have it up here. But another way to think about this is that there's physics here. And there's biochemistry over here. And that's really important because physics is like really precise. Like the electromagnetic wave is at a wavelength. And it travels at a certain velocity. And the sound waves are also have their own frequencies. With biochemical, so we know we can at least create a source of light that is at a given frequency, or a sound wave that's at a certain frequency and a certain intensity. We don't know how everybody's going to hear them or see them, if they're going to see the colors the same or not. Right? We've talked about colorblind. People are going to see the colors different. Animals are going to see the colors different. You can create something that tastes like something, but it's not really physics. In the sense, how do you make a reference of that? You can, and we saw some examples in the last class of how you test for things like taste or smell. But it's a little bit more fuzzy.
So that would be a flow line. Inside we see CO2.
At least the stimulus is easier to reproduce. Here you can, if you keep it to very simplistic things. If I say, okay, I have a glass of water and it has only salt in it, and this is the concentration of salt, then I know whatever it is, it's going to be the same, and someone can repeat the experiment in some other place. But we've talked about cookies and bananas and things like that, which vary a lot. You know, from one banana to another banana, you can have very different tastes. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question about layers. Years, ice have layers. They have the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. So just think of the front part of the eye is what's allowing you to collect the electromagnetic radiation that's coming in and getting it to a place where it can start to be transformed.
But ears don't have.
Ears do too, because they collect the moving molecules before they get to a place where they can be transformed. I lost my cursor. All right, so now we're going to get into touch, which is very different. So you can point to your eyes. Have you ever played this game? Eyes, ears, nose, mouth. Where do you touch? Where do you feel the sense of touch? It's pretty much all over the place, outside and inside, right? So it's really different in that respect. So when it's outside, when we're touching something that presumably we could also see, maybe, or it's outside of the body, then we just think of it as touch, like external. If it's something that's inside, then we think of it as interosensing. That doesn't mean that there can't be some biological or biochemical aspect of something that's going on inside. The question is, how are you gonna feel that? So if we go back to this more simplistic view of the world, we can just think of touch now, or interosensing, as things that we're sensing from inside of ourselves. So it's our environment, but it's an environment inside of ourselves. There is a relationship between touch and emotions, and it's a relationship that's so complicated that even our language is very complicated around it. So we can say, I am touched by your sorrow, which doesn't mean you're touched by someone's sorrow. Or I can say, I am in touch with her, or I feel for you, or I feel the wind blowing on my face, or I feel the pain in my lower back, or I have no feelings for him, or I have no feelings in my arm. And so this makes it really confusing, actually, I've found, and others have found, who study things like emotions and feelings. Because the language itself isn't real distinct. So when I say I have feelings, it's hard to know what that exactly is. So this translates over into Spanish, although my Spanish is not as good as my English. These are examples last year's class gave, which was estoy conmovido, estoy en contacto, lo siento mucho versus lo siento mucho. All right, so we talked a little bit about definitions. There's a word in English called viscous, and viscous is an internal organ of the body. And basically, there's another word called visceral, and the definition of visceral is that it's felt in or as if it was in an internal organ of the body. If you look, it also has other definitions. One of them is dealing with crude or emotional or elemental emotions, or non-intellectual. So visceral starts to sound like interoception, like basically something that you're feeling inside of yourself that may be related to an organ. But unlike things that we've talked about before, where I can tell you, hey, there's taste buds, and there's receptors, or there's eyeballs, and they're broken down into these parts, and each one does these things. When we get to interoception, we have a lot less information. So I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly how it works because people don't know exactly how it works. And you can imagine it works in very different things, which means it's complicated. So here we're going to have some definitions. Let me hide this. Sorry. We're going to say that interoception is the perception of the state of the body. And we're going to acknowledge that there's a restrictive meaning, which means sensations originating from the organs. But there's a more general meaning that just means really anything related to something that's going on inside of you. And that's what we're using in this class. So when we say interoception, we are literally meaning things that you're feeling that are intero inside of yourself. And this is important in case you get to a point where you really need to study one of these internal types of sensing mechanisms and you start reading literature. Just recognize that the word interoception means different things to different people. And there are whole scientific articles on what the word means. So that's why I don't want to suggest to you here that it has one specific. Touch is all about the self. You can respond to things that are stimuluses in the outside environment, or you can respond to things that are going on inside of you, or you can combine the two. So you can, scratch your back and you can feel the outside or the inside, or you can push on yourself to the point that you can feel things going on inside of you. Or sometimes if a doctor thinks that you're sick or something, they'll touch your throat and squeeze till you say, ow. And you can feel things outside and you can feel things inside. So what that means is that there's really no clear distinction between what it means to touch outside versus what it means to touch inside. You could potentially have a little bit if you were to mildly maybe touch a hair, maybe. But even there, your hair is connected to your skin. And so it's hard to imagine to do much to that hair without causing something inside to happen. So if you take away one thing from that slide, it's just that there's not really a clear dividing line from what it means to touch outside versus to what it means to touch inside. I happen to think it's the most amazing and important sense. If you gave me a choice of taste, smell, sight, sound, and I was forced to get rid of them, I would first not want to get rid of any of them, but if I had to, I would think I would put touch at the end of the list. But to me, the world would feel very different. I'd be scared, actually, what would happen to my emotions. I would worry about if I could actually care about someone if I didn't feel anything at all. Like no touch, nothing going on in my stomach, or no butterflies going on, or anything like that. I would worry about that. Sense of touch begins before we're born, apparently. There are touch receptors inside and outside and all throughout your body. If you were somehow able to touch, inside organs, which some of them you can, and you push on them, you're going to feel things from inside the organs. If you look at the skin, you're going to see that there's different types of receptors inside the skin that start to respond depending on what you're doing to your skin. Touch is sensitive to all 5 types of sensible energies. Force, electromagnetic energy. You can feel the sun on your skin. You feel the warmth. Biochemical interactions. Thermal energy, heat, ice, or electrical energy. It's pretty awesome sense. Right? You might say, well, my tongue is sensitive too to all 5, but really the receptors that are biochemically sensitive can have some sensitivity to electrical energy and to thermal energy. And when you start talking about force, you really start talking about touch again, because your tongue, integral to it, has touch sensors as well. So if you squeeze your tongue, which I don't recommend you do, you can feel that. And if you squeeze it a lot, you can feel it. And if you bite your tongue, you can really feel it, and that's touch. It's pretty complicated in terms of how all this touch stuff going on, from your toes to your feet to inside your body, is all getting into your brain, and how when you feel upset or hungry or sad or mad or in love, you also feel things going on throughout your body. So to me, when I think about what Lisa's describing in her book, and we see how relatively straightforward senses like sight and sound are pretty complicated, and we can imagine that sight for the most part is coming through the eyes, and then we're building up concepts on top of it, our imagination, that emotions and touch would be very complicated to understand and to put words around. But suffice it to stay at the end there that there are more questions and answers that remain in science with respect to touch than there are with respect to taste, smell, sight, and sound. We have computers, artificial systems, robots pretty commonly make use of sight and sound. Not so common to make use of smell, touch, and taste. But touch is actually one that's pretty common. Pressure sensors are pretty common. We'll see some as we go throughout. But even though we can think of things like pressure sensors, we have to remember that touch is very complicated because we touch outside and inside and throughout our entire bodies. So can we make a robotic artificial system that has some sense of touch, not about just when their hand touches something so they can feel some resistance and not knock it over, right? Or move it without crushing it, But can we include those types of such sensors inside of their bodies, if you will, so that they can feel what's going on with the mechanical mechanisms inside of themselves as well? Your homework reminded you that there were 5 sensible energies. Some of you got it all right. Some of you didn't. All of the homeworks have been graded and you have access to them. But sensible energies is something I like to keep coming back throughout the class because it's sort of fundamental. So here are some examples of what touch receptors look like. So now you have a visual for what I talked about before, about how they're both inside. I'll move over here so I can point to the screen. I like to sit in front of here because I think it sounds better in the Moodle. You have to listen to it. So here's some of your outside touch sensors. And then the deeper you go, there are different types of receptors depending on how much pressure. So if you just articulating the hairs here, you may not activate these types of sensors that are deeper inside. They all have names. It's important here really is not that you memorize all these names, but that you recognize that when you have touch, that you have things that are both outside and inside of your body. That your brain then is getting signals from now, not just your eyes or not just your ears, but it's getting signals from all outside of your body and all inside of your body and all really inside of your body. And it has to try to somehow form some simulated reality. So I like to think about this as touch, interoception, and external touch as not being as crisp as sight and sound. Where I can build vocabulary around sound. I can see images, shapes, and build language around vision. But it's harder for me to imagine how I can build language around feelings coming from my touch sensors. It's possible. Right? People that can't see, can't hear, what do they do to build language around touch? Stick is one. What about when they're reading? Braille. Yeah. So stick when they're moving around, and braille when they're trying to read. So it's possible to do. Most of us probably wouldn't be able to do it unless we absolutely had to do it. We couldn't see anymore, we couldn't hear anymore. We have language constructs, and we would just have to learn how to remap those to things that we felt. But if we couldn't feel, we would have taste and smell. Harder for me to imagine how to create a language. I'm sure one exists. Basic things like, hey, it's time for dessert. It's easy. So like most things, science has spent a lot of time trying to figure out more things about your senses of touch. There's something called this 2-point test where basically you don't get to see anything and they touch you with 2 things. See how close you can discern that, what type part of your body. So if I do this, I can, can't do this test on myself. Basically, someone else does it to you. And at some point, you'll come to the point where you wouldn't be able to distinguish the distance between 2 pins. And that's sort of your touch resolution at that part of your body. You can also do the same thing with the amount of pressure. can you actually touch someone without them knowing that you touched them? So what was the lowest amount of contact that you can make before that happens? There are parts of your body that you may think that that's not possible. But for most people, there are places on the bottom of your foot that you can touch and you won't feel it because you've built up basically calluses there that don't have these things that if you push hard enough, you feel it. And that's an experiment you can do on yourself, because if you touch yourself at the bottom of your foot, it'll feel different than if you're touching yourself in your hand, because you're feeling it from here, you're feeling it from here. But if you touch a callus on the bottom of your foot, you're going to feel it from here, but not necessarily from the bottom of your foot. So I'm not sure how they measure these thresholds, but there are thresholds that they measure depending on like the sensitivity. I suppose it's when you can't take it anymore or something. But some parts of your hands are more sensitive than other parts of the back part of your hand versus the front part of your hand. If you want to increase the sensitivity of your finger to airflow, you want to know what direction the breeze is coming from.
Yeah. See where the force is. You feel it where like the heaviness.
Get it wet. Lick it. Get it wet, or you can put saliva. Two approaches, right? So you're basically changing the sensitivity now of your skin, and adding a little bit of a thermal component to it. Actually, in addition to feeling, you're actually feeling now some of the temperature. How many people think that it feels colder when you get out of the shower before you dry off? It feels cold. Is it colder? Maybe. A lot of times it's not cold. In fact, it may even be warmer, because if you can shower with hot water in a room somewhat closed, it might actually be warmer in that room. But it may feel colder because you're changing some aspect of the interface of your skin sensors and your touch sensors to the environment. So all this is meant to leave you here thinking, wow, this touch stuff is really complicated. But it should also leave you with, this touch stuff is really, if I want to make breakthrough strides in the understanding of artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence, maybe I need to do my research work after I graduate in the area of touch. Maybe that's an area that's been underappreciated or underinvestigated in comparison to things like vision and sound. So at some point, we're going to get as much as we can from analyzing picture or video, and we're going to get as much as we can from analyzing sound. That's all physics. We're going to get as much as we can from analyzing sound together with vision. But at some time, we're going to have to really tackle these issues associated with smell, taste, and especially touch. Because we move around very quickly, and we interact with our environment with touch. And it's not just touch outside of our body, it's touch inside. It's not just touching our fingertips, it's touch throughout. That's the most important really point of going through all this. This is just to remind us that wherever these touch receptors are, outside or inside the body, the outside environment has to interact with them, which could be through a physical force, or it could be like a breeze or fear. convert it into electrical signals. Those electrical signals are going to try to make their way all the way up to your brain. But if they're down here, they got a long way to go. Right? So that's part of what I mean by the lack of crispness. Have you ever been had an itch on your back? Probably yes. You live in Puerto Rico, you've had an itch on the back too. Sometimes it feels like it's here, and you scratch here, and it feels like it's over here. Right? And what do you have to do? Basically, you have to ask someone. And then it could be over here. It's kind of a strange thing, but when you don't have your eyesight to help you, you are literally have responses coming from all over your surface area of your back, from where whatever it was, maybe or stinging or irritated you. And it's interacting with things that are interacting with things that are then coming to your brain, and your brain is trying to figure out what's going on back there. May not be anything that's going on. Have you ever maybe seen a mosquito and then felt something, or seen a spider before you went to bed, and then feel something crawling? And there's nothing crawling on, there's just a breeze, but you have that stuff. So you can see how things associated with touch, and feelings, and emotions rely very, very heavily on layer 4 and layer 5 to make stuff up. Just totally make stuff up. Wild guesses as to what's going on. Wild guesses as to what's going on. Which is why some of us go throughout our lives and we still have wild guesses as to what's going on when it has things to do with feelings and emotions. It's just hard stuff. So part of the reason for the HSI model, which we'll go through at the end again today, is when you're dealing with these hard things to remember that they're complicated and try to use that model as a reference and try to understand what it is that you're feeling or experiencing, whether it's some bug bite or some emotion. You can go through the slides. I'm not going to quiz you on what the names of all these things are. It's more so the concepts. So the concepts that I'm talking to you about are the concepts that I expect you to know. And so the question is, the touch sensors are so specific that you can identify exactly where everybody can identify where that. Through the falls explaining, I would expect you to be able to explain. Or if I would say, when someone touches you, they continue to put pressure, continue to put pressure, why does it feel different? I would expect you to know, well, initially, I have some receptors that are on the skin, like in here, and I have also some that are like way deep in my skin. The harder you push, those folks are going to start. Then you have some in there that are like mechanical alarm. If you hit your finger with a hammer, you're going to hit those instantaneously. But you can also get to them if you just someone keeps poking really hard. Eventually, you're going to get the touch sensors that are so deep inside that they say, hey, if I'm feeling something, like something's not good. Right? So they're going to sort of send a message straight to your brain that says, move, hit someone, run, something, right? But you can actually train yourself to not respond to some of these. If you do some reading, you'll see that there's some military trainings for people, like pilots, that they think might get caught behind enemy lines. And they teach them how to learn how to ignore some of kind of like what we talked about, where you had the glasses that would flip the environment, where you can learn how to see the environment. Not an easy thing to do. So.
Yeah, about the training I've seen that they do similar trainings to astronauts who move space. Yeah, there was this one case that the guy, his suit was filled with water, but he hit himself first. So yeah, it was training the brain to not going to hand to be professional. It's really hard.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that. Let me do a little time check. Okay. So we've talked a lot about inputs. When we're talking about the eyes, we were talking about inputs. Ears, we were talking about inputs. We can move our eyes around by moving our head around. We can move our ears and our tongue in our nose. We haven't really talked about outputs a lot, but if you remember in layer 2, there's receptors and there's actuators. Actuators mean things that do something. So when I'm talking about touch, I'm talking about the same types of things that allow me to also respond and move things. And you'll see that there are some cases where those signals, before they make it all the way back to your brain, they'll actually cause things to happen. And probably one of the most common examples people know is if you hit, like, take a little hand, hit like somewhere in here, you can make the leg move. And that's literally a short circuit that's going from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3 to layer 2 to layer 1. So it doesn't actually make it. It won't make it to 5 and 6, but you can demonstrate that without, it'll make it to 4, 5, 6, 7, because you'll be aware of it. But there's actually a bit of a short circuit between 1, 2, 3 and 3, 2, 1, where you'll move even if it doesn't get to your brain. Some of you may have seen some insects or bugs where this is also the same thing. You may have seen them in an unfortunate predicament where they may be missing parts of their body, but they're still moving around. If you're touching this thing. With that said, it's not a big surprise to know that that parts of your brain that are associated with sensing touch, meaning that they tend to be more active when you have things touching you or related to the sense of touch, are very close to parts of your brain related to moving. That kind of makes sense, right? Because when we're moving, we're touching things all the time. So that feedback is what allows us to respond quickly. If I were to move back, and there was a cat laying on the floor behind me, there's a very good chance that I would not squash that cat, even if I didn't know it was there. Because as soon as I did this, like to move back, I would very quickly know that I couldn't just move my foot to the ground and make some sort of adjustment. But how did that happen so quickly with information coming from all the way down to the foot, all the way up to the brain, potentially some combination of those processes, those short circuits between 1, 2, 3, 2, back to 1, 4, down, through predictions that are happening based on what I expect to happen backwards. So as soon as something that I expect to happen or not happen doesn't happen or happens, and that triggers alerts that cause my subconsciousness to know that something's going on that's outside of the range of And these are maps that you'll find in textbooks showing you sort of where activity tends to be on the brain, depending on what part of your body. And the reason this is elongated is because it turns out that a big chunk of that brain area goes into sort of managing your head. And another big chunk goes into managing things related to your fingers and your arm. And as it happens, a relatively smaller part goes into managing like your knit. I imagine you could probably change that. Maybe if you didn't have any arms, maybe you become more sensitive to things that are happening. Maybe you could even train yourself to pinpoint locations on your back if you practice. That's the other side of the brain. That's the example we talked about, the spinal reflex. This is the short circuit we talked about. So this is an artificial touch sensor. Basically, it's got an array of pressure sensors here that interacts with a force that causes voltage changes in this electrode array. It causes signals that can be picked up by some electrical circuits. So you can imagine if you wanted to make an artificial being, then you might want to cover it with all sorts of sensors. I think you would want to cover it with hair too, actually. So you could sense things that were before they directly touched all of it. One of the things that people talk about that makes humans different is that they have a sense of themselves and their bodies. And I'm going to suggest to you that if you create a robot that sensors all over its body and allow it to sort of move around and get feedback from all that, and you have the right algorithms and a lot of processing, that at some point you could create a being that would know basically that if it did certain things, it would fall over. All right, so now we're going to get, I'm going to try to show you something that I think, we're going to go to something called backyard brains. So this is taking some electronics. Let's see.
In our buttons. If the lights on either side turn on, you know it's working. It's time to plug in the cockroach. Notice that nice wing flapping behavior when I pick him up by the connector. That's a fairly stereotyped behavior that students like to observe to wonder about the mechanics of wing flapping. Now that he's on the table, simply plug in the connector gently. But how do we get it to stay on the cockroach? Take your hot glue again and put a small dab on the underside. And then stick the package firmly on the center of the cockroach. It's not too hot. Don't worry, the cockroach is fine. Now place the cockroach on the floor, and when he starts running, start stimulating the left and right sides and see what you observe. How long do the behaviors last? Does he always turn left and right upon stimulation? Does the cockroach appear to show any sort of learning or adaptation upon repeated stimulation? Are you competing with any other sorts of behaviors? There are many types of questions you can ask about stimulation and your responses with this simple prep. Done with your experiment, it's time for the cockroach to go back into his house to eat and rest. Put him in your refrigerator to slow him down a bit. Then with your forceps, carefully ease the connector from the stimulator package. And slowly peel it off. And put the cockroach back in his house. Sorry for that unsightly scar on my hand. I was using the oil of my Tercel last weekend. Busted knuckles.
So
Now you can start asking independent questions of your own.
normally I worry about like doing, animal cruelty and stuff, but most people just step on cockroaches. So that, to me, that's a lot nicer than like stepping on words. But I think it's important because it's one of those kind of a rare situation where you can really see an interface between some artificial parts related to stimulus and what's going on in presumably some semblance of a layer 4, 5, 6, and 7, if you think cockroaches have some consciousness. I don't know if they do or don't. We've talked about that before. I probably would lean on the side that they do. So usually, I actually don't step on cockroaches unless they happen to be like in my room. I call it the safe zone. And even then, I try to just get them out. Okay, that video is on your link, so you can watch the whole thing and try to understand. But again, I think it's one of the it's rare to see an example where you can kind of combine things that are living with things that are not living and try to understand parts of both systems. Here they had it as a remote control, but you can do the same thing if you have parts of bugs. And that's just an experiment where they took that same pressure interface now and interfaced it to the leg of the bug. And then by pushing on the pressure sensor, if they pushed a lot, then the leg would move more. This is that talk I mentioned at the very beginning that I suggest that you watch. It's talking about this experiment here on the right is where they have a person look basically at this fake arm that they know is a fake arm, and eventually the person believes that that fake arm is actually their arm. Okay. Which gets us to about 15 minutes worth of talking about things that we've talked about before. You're going to be here 15 minutes anyway. You might as well ask questions to help you on the exam. So if you're looking at that and you know all that stuff, it's all fresh in your head, then I wouldn't worry about anything. But if you see things that you want to talk about.
That slide would be on the middle.
Huh? Yeah. The slide will be on there. This isn't to say everything on here is going to be on your exam. But it does mean that I believe you would have good knowledge about all of these areas. So if there were questions on the exam, that you'd be able to answer them.
We have to know, like, if you was an action or an event, or to clarify it in the HPAI model.
I think that is something you definitely want to know about. Yeah. And so I created this extra slide just in case that question came in. I don't know if I had shown this before, but it is in the paper. By now, the HSI model should be pretty intuitive to you because I want you to be able to use it as a reference for when we go through sensing and perception and everything in the class. Yeah. You won't have to do any programming, but I expect you to know like something about what CoLab is, how it works, what are the libraries that you use, that kind of stuff. It may or may not be on the exam, but I would expect you to know that. In other words, when you were doing your CoLab homework, and when we went through the CoLab experiment in class, that worked because there's an environment that's provided that's going to have some libraries. What are the libraries that are in there that we use, that kind of stuff. Not all of you got everything right on the homework, so definitely look at the homeworks. I could tell from some of the homeworks that some of you were still a little confused on the model. So if you are, I would suggest that you go back and read the paper, look through the notes again, look through your homeworks again, and then come see me if you're still confused about that, because there's no, I mean, if you come see me at least a few minutes, I don't mind going through that, or put some questions up on Piazza. So you understand that whether you're, we're talking about sight, electromagnetic radiation as one of the physical energies, or we're talking about taste, that physical occurrence thing is happening here and somehow getting to some receptor that's somewhere inside or outside of you that's in here that then transforms into some sort of electrical signal that makes it up to your brain. And that your brain has some intelligence that's built up over experience that you have really little control over, that makes some decisions based on what's coming in, and then transforms that into some higher level guess as to what's happening, and presents that to your consciousness as its best representation of reality. But that this is a simulated reality because your consciousness doesn't have direct access to this physical occurrence. And that when we communicate with others, if we want them to be able to interact with us, we need to have some intelligible thought that we somehow get through all these layers so they can change some physical energy. If I want to communicate with them with touch, then I want to communicate with some force. Or with voice, also some force. I could think about how to communicate with smells, taste. Put my finger in their mouth, but they would taste it. And then that's got to get all the way through to them and back, right? If they want to say something to me, I have to understand it here. And then we talk a lot about what's going on inside of ourselves. That's what we've been doing the last few weeks. And we have this communication that's going on inside of ourselves when we're communicating with our environment. When we're brainstorming, our consciousness may be just communicating with our subconsciousness. We may not be paying much attention to what's happening from our senses. I think in last year, one of the modeling questions had like some fictitious animal I created. And that animal had certain attributes. And you had to create a model. Now we're not talking about the HSI model. We're talking about this particular being. And in your first homework, you had a professor that you picked, where you had some talk about how they think, feel, and behave. So I think last year we had some fictitious animal I created that had some odd ways of behaving and thinking, and the students created models that helped them kind of get their arms around that. And with the idea being, if you created a good model around this weird thing, maybe you can make a toy that had that behavior because you had captured basically its functionality in your model. And this was one example of a model that we saw in class. Fairly complicated model because there's all sorts of squigglies doing all sorts of things. But really not that complicated. There's only maybe less than 10 things in the model. So model have, they have some common attributes. They have components. One component here is long-term memory. Motive activation. Deliberate processes. Meta-management. Action, perception. Reactive processes. The environment. And a variable threshold attention function. So this is trying to describe an intelligent agent, basically, that has some artificial general intelligence characteristics, and there's a lot of information that you can get from this model. It's important to have the components, show whatever interdependencies that you believe are important. Any conditions, here they have a condition of a variable threshold for attention. And then labels. Labels are really important. So if you're going to create a model, it's really important to label it. And then it's really important to be able to provide some description about the model. If this is hard, feel free to come by Monday morning or set up some time. But I would expect that if I give you some arbitrary thinking, tell you a few things about it, that you would be able to create a visual model. Whether it's boxes pointing to different things or some flow chart, something, I expect you to be able to, that model would have the main components in it. You have the main things that are interacting or flowing. You would have some labels, some words, and then a description. And the reason for that, again, is not to make life harder, it's to help you with allowing you to, any complex system that you see in life, whether you're trying to code it or just trying to understand why your friend's being weird, that you would be able to try to say, well, what's important here? What am I observing? Maybe I can sketch out what's happening here to understand it. Because if you can define a model that characterizes the main things that you're interested in, And normally you can code it, because normally you can code components and interactions between things. We still have a few more minutes. Anything you want to share with your students, other students that you think is going to be on the exam? Yes.
I remember what decision making.
Decision making, you helped me decide what new restaurant I was going to try. And we went through a step process of doing that. That's classical decision making. Human decision making, we just did actually kind of an example, but there you saw, like when you did your professors, that it could be all over the place, right? And so when I ask questions like that, there's not one right answer. It's actually really hard for me. Usually professors don't like to ask questions like that, because it means they have to read it and really understand it, right, to grade it. But when we're talking about humans, there can't be one right answer. It just has to be the components, or the key components there that are involved. Are they described, in a way? Are they labeled and things like that for models? We did do some AI decision making when we did the homework on the ratings. The CoLab program had to decide, based on some words that were written, whether or not what the person's rating would be. So that's some decision making that we did using the libraries in CoLab for machine learning. Well, I'm really excited because I think you're going to do really great. How many? Let's take a little survey here. How many think there's going to definitely be a question on modeling? How many think there's definitely going to be some question related to the HSI model? Feldman? Actually, let's talk about Feldman, because we really didn't talk about it for today. It's just, I think there's like 2 or 3 concepts that I would think that you would know from the book. So it's just, we'll end on that note. Who wants to say what one of those things are? So 3 important things that we learned from Dr. Lisa Feldman's book so far. They don't have to be the most important. Just
Fear. How people perceive fear, emotion, feel fear, get scared.
how do people get scared by something? We learned that in part that they construct something that's related to something that they're seeing, which can be fear.
Well, how emotions are actually constructed and not like made biologically by birth. It's more about conception and about experience, or what you think about an emotion rather than how you feel. But no emotion has a there, even because you make a set face that means that you set. There, the fingerprints that she wanted to do.
Right, that everybody, that people respond, and even we respond differently. There's a lot of variables associated with that.
A lot more variables.
And then I'll end it on this one, which is that we're not passive. Like we are predicting what's happening. And that's true whether we're hearing something, far and far, right? We're predicting that we heard it and we're creating that sound in our head. And the same is true about emotions. That we're predicting our emotions. We're not just having emotions. So in a way, we're creating our own reality, whether it's audio or whether it's emotion. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited about Monday. Probably you guys are too. And I think you're going to do great. So thanks a bunch.